Welcome to Cover to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. To do justice to our guest's impressive resume would take the majority of this program. We do want to hit some of the highlights. He has received fellowships from the Rockefeller, Fulbright, and Guggenheim Foundations. He's taught at Dartmouth, Yale, Wesleyan, Vermont and Middlebury Colleges, as well as colleges in Switzerland and Budapest. He founded the New England Review in 1977, was once a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. In fact, he was Vermont's Poet Laureate from 2011 to 2015 and received the Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts in 2021. His stories, poems, essays, and criticism have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The New York Times, Sports Illustrated, and many other periodicals, as well as more than 50 anthologies. His latest work is his novel, New Look, and we are very pleased to welcome Sidney Lee.
Thank you very much, Roger. Pleasure to be here and an honor.
Before we get into a slight digression, I have to ask about Sports Illustrated. That sounds like a little out of your normal range. How did that come about?
You don't know? That's an avant-garde poetry journal. No, I first I wrote an essay about taking a nephew of mine who's been severely compromised by asthma years and years and years ago. He's now in his 40s, and he's lucky to be alive, in fact. I took him on a hiking trip, an overnight camping trip, and I decided to write about that, about the approach to the top of the mountain and how we fared when we were up there. And I didn't know really where to send it, so I sent it to Sports Illustrated, and owing to some miracle, they decided that they liked it a lot. And subsequently, I did a book about the death of a hunting, not a book, I'm sorry, an article about the death of a hunting dog, and they published that as well. And I haven't really generated anything since that I thought would be appropriate, but I must say, I was paid more for one or two articles in Sports Illustrated than I will for a whole poetry book, no matter what. So it was a happy circumstance.
So I have to ask, getting more about you, were you always going to be a poet and author?
Hardly. In fact, if you had watched me when I was an 18-year-old typical witless American adolescent male, hockey playing, chasing girls, and trying to steal beer, that's probably the last thing you would have decided I would be. But I found that under the influence of the older generation, and one of the characters in this book, Now Look, is modeled on it's kind of composite of a number of them whom I knew. They were such great raconteurs that their voices kept, as they still do, echoing in my mind. And I thought, well, it would be great to get them down on the page, but I didn't feel I could write anything in any genre in dialect, because it would be too easy to sound like I was condescending, which was quite the opposite from the way I felt about these old folks. I mean, I'm talking about people who'd be 120 or so now, who lives up in this part of the state of Maine, which is where I am at my little cabin. They've been up here since well before electricity, let alone anything else, and they had to make their own entertainment, so they did that by way of telling stories. It was a real oral culture, such as we'll never see again. And so I came up with this theory for some reason, that if I tried to record some stories that were not theirs but like theirs in poetry, I might be able to capture some of the rhythms of their speech without having to imitate it. And that's what got me launched. I mean, I was pretty late in blooming. I didn't publish my first book till I was 40, so I had pursued an academic path up to that point.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that the constraints that poetry forces on you make you a better writer in a novel?
Well, I certainly hope so. I do know this. You know, people often say, "Well, how do you?" Because I've written just one other novel, but I've 7 books of personal essays. I just published one this last January. And people ask me, well, you know, what's the difference between, how do you choose which genre you're going to write in? And it sounds a little bit mystical, but in fact, it feels like the genres choose me.
Mhm.
And I sit down to write about it. Something gets me writing, and the form it takes almost seems like it's out of my hands. I don't mean to say that I'm divinely inspired or anything like that, but there is something a little bit mysterious about the way that happens.
You know, a lot of the authors that I talk to tell me that at some point they start to write a particular situation and the character will speak to them and say, no, I wouldn't do that. And they end up changing it. Does that happen to you?
That has happened to me. Or I write something about a character and I think to myself, do I really want that character to behave in such and such a way when people might attach him or her to a living being?
Mhm.
So I do go through those kinds of considerations to be sure. But the characters do take on a life of their own. There's no doubt about it, and and I often don't know what they're going to do. I mean, I think in a way it's better, certainly better if I'm writing poetry, if I don't know too clearly where I'm going, because then I lose the that kind of delicious savor of discovery that comes out in the writing. Something presents itself to me which I hadn't anticipated, and if I know too clearly, where I'm going, from A to Z, then characters and words and symbols and metaphors and whatever else you want to gather into that bag will kind of lead me by the nose to the conclusion that I already know. And I think the result tends to be quite wooden and stiff and unconvincing.
Mm. Yeah, I was thinking about the poetry and how you condense things so much in that. And I ran into this. I'm going to read you one of your own paragraphs. It's very short, but it spoke to me. And it was said that Harley Ferguson could lift a full keg of nails off the ground. Billy McPeak, some claimed, lived all one summer, nothing but watermelon and vanilla. Louis McLean was the best storyteller in a place full of storytellers. But that's the only time they show up in the book. And yet they have that telling detail that gives you a piece of, there's a whole lot more out there. So congratulations
Oh,
on that.
well, thank you for that. And both of those, the business about lifting the nail keg and the business about living on vanilla and watermelon. I think the man caught some fish as well. But those are true stories. And Louis McLean, who was a principal figure in my only other novel, which was written 30 years ago, uh, is a real character. His real name was George MacArthur, but
Mhm.
I called him Louis McLean then, and I did hear a little nod to him in the second novel.
Yeah. There's a lot of tragedy in this book, but there's also transformation and a certain redemption. Now, is the title intended to reinforce those times when people suddenly see their life through new eyes or the lives of somebody else through new eyes?
Well, both ways. I mean, in a sense, the first time we see that pair of words, "now look," it's they come from the wife of one of the two principal characters, who's an old timer from this part of Maine, and she remembers him as a young and vibrant man. He was a river driver back in the days when logs were moved by water, and then she says at the end of the reminiscence, because of alcohol, she says, "Now look."
Mhm.
Uh, but later along, the phrase comes up too, and I think you're acute to notice that that can be taken two ways. One is, now look at all the wreckage behind us, but also have a look at what is still possibly available. I mean, the ending of the book is ambiguous, and I'm not going to introduce my own spoiler, but
Yeah.
certainly there is room for imagining redemption a better outcome.
Uh, From the reader's perspective, at least from this reader's perspective, the core of the book is the relationship of George Mays, the Ivy educated person, Ivy League educated person, and the logger, Evan Butcher, and how that changes over time. Of course, a novel is all about developing what changes during the events of the novel. But this seems to have a relationship. Does this have a analogy between you and some of the people that you knew back then?
It certainly does, Roger. I mean, enough that I'm not ashamed to talk about it. But I was certainly addicted to alcohol from a very early age. Certainly all through college. it got worse and worse. I'm pleased to say that it's been a number of decades since I've been in recovery, but certainly the reminiscences of outrageous as many of them are of college days, that they're not factually true to my own experience, but as it were, metaphorically true to the kinds of things I might do and how I felt about them. And similarly, the feelings that I developed having, by the grace of some power beyond me and a number of very, very good friends also in recovery, that too is based on my own experience. And the older man I refer to in the novel is actually a composite figure. So the principal figure whom I recall in writing it did undergo an almost incredible, you wouldn't believe it, almost if somebody told you. I hope you believe it in the novel, but he had one tragedy after another. A daughter who died at 16, a son who was born with cystic fibrosis and died young, a son who came home from Vietnam, truly crazy, a grandson who got involved in addiction and took his own life. That was all in one family, so that much is true. There's a double suicide in there, which actually did not happen to him. It happened to another old man I knew.
Yeah. Certainly play. I get the kind of almost a bit of Job coming through on this from time to time.
Well, I've heard that before, and I don't know that. I mean, to me, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are sources of perhaps all kinds of meditative material, but in terms of language and situation and so on, I don't know that I really had that in mind. But subliminally, you may very well be right. I mean, I've always marveled at the Book of Job, and I mean, I don't think I'd have hung in there that long myself, but interesting, and I don't know that I'd have hung in that long if I'd suffered the tragedies that this old man referred to did.
Well, I bounce around a lot here, but as an old DJ, I noticed reference to performers. There's one where you managed to work, and this is I won't give the background away, but you might work in Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, Hannibal Adderley, Wes Montgomery, Grant Green, Kenny Burrell, and Joe Pass, some of the best jazz guitar players out there. I assume you're an aficionado?
Well, I mean, I certainly was when I was in college and graduate school, because I was in New Haven, and I could get down to New York and see these brilliant musicians perform. Now it's mostly by way of nostalgia and my quaint vinyl and CD collection. But I wonder if my son, whose name is Creston Lee, named for a local character up here, is I've heard him described as an iconic maker of custom guitars. And just yesterday, 2 days ago, I guess Bill Frisell was playing one of his instruments at the Newport Jazz Festival. I'm very proud of that, and it might have impelled that notion of remembering mostly jazz guitarists in the catalog.
That is sweet. I really appreciate that. Also, one more thing, you do a little paragraph about Hollywood. Oh, you say jabbering Lou Costello, gaunt hero Gary Cooper, and the Hollywood gunslingers long ago since forgotten, Hoot Gibson, Bob Steele, Johnny Mac Brown, the rest all in Boot Hill now. This,
right.
I used to collect comics as a child. I'm only a couple of years younger than you are, and I had a bunch of those people that appeared in the comics, particularly Johnny Mac Brown in particular.
Oh yeah. I remember them very clearly from the little local movie theater in my native Pennsylvania, a little town called Ambler outside of Philadelphia. For 10 cents, we would go on Sunday afternoons, and if you had 20 cents, you could buy 10 cents for admission, and then another 10 cents to buy milk duds or something like that, many of which were used for ammunition against other kids in the audience. But younger, I wouldn't have realized that you were pushing 80 yourself.
Yeah. Well, I will say this, that at one point in the book you talk about, you assess the fact that jujubes are okay ammunition, but melt guns are a lot better. So
Yeah,
I insight that our next generation can use if they really wanted to learn about that.
yeah, I think they're both still manufactured, so the price of tickets has gone up somewhat.
It has indeed in there. Oh gosh, so much to talk about here that, and this is one fun fact about the younger hero and the fact that he would always want to take the opposite side of what anybody else, and it doesn't matter what it was, he just had to disagree. And then he had this trick that he used. Tell us about that, because I think that's fun.
Are you talking the argument that well, and I'm afraid that that's based on me to some degree too, that I loved contention. And, I had been, as I say in the book, I mean, I won't paraphrase, I won't quote myself even accurately, but by turns a Buddhist, a Catholic, atheist, uh, a Republican, a Democrat, what have you, as long as it was the opposite of what you were trying to persuade me of argumentation. And I, looking back on that, I kind of I chuckle at myself in a way, and I also cringe a bit because I took some positions which I wouldn't even touch with a 10-foot pole today.
Well, in one of the cases, you have your character using a sneaky debate trick in which he invents a person, a French philosopher, because he is a French major, and is able and quotes something in French and then translates it slowly, kind of emphasizing, "You dumbo, why don't you know this?" Yeah, it's wonderful.
That was me too. I'm afraid my French remains quite good, and it's all because of a high school teacher of D. He was just a brilliant teacher. But I would do that, I'd make up the name of some philosopher that nobody had ever heard of simply because he or she did not exist, and then I'd quote a little bit. I would use that as kind of material or fodder for my whatever my argument was. And I must say that many times I was significantly enough in my cups that the next day I couldn't quite remember what the argument was about. Well, funny enough now, but not so much then.
Yeah. There's a lot of, I would call them Easter eggs, a lot of nice little snippets that feel poetic in it. In one of them, you talk about, I'm going to find my note here. She yanked the plug and filled the cup with the cub bears looking down from a tree. The picture of the trunk wore off a long time back. So the bears seemed like they were flying, angel bears. That's such a beautiful little detail. It just puts you right in the spot.
Well, thank you so much. And that, in fact, I made up. So I'm pleased that it resonated with you.
Yeah. When it kind of feels like there might be more to this story, and is there any chance that this will be extended in later books?
Well, Father Time is undefeated so far as I know. I'm 81. Whether I'll do another novel or not, it's hard to say. But I was talking earlier about the way in which the genre seemed to impose itself upon me rather than the other way. My first novel, called A Place in Mind, which will soon be reissued by the same publisher, Down East Books. I had just published a book of poems, and I was going through the usual post book of poems publication period of why am I bothering with this? Nobody cares what I have to say, especially in poetry. Nobody will read it, and so on and so forth. So, but I still wanted to write. I mean, I have an impulse to write, which is almost catastrophic sometimes. But at any rate, so I said, well, I'm going to write just a prose piece about, and I will try and unravel the story that was told to me by Lewis McLean, or actually his real name, as I said, was George MacArthur. It just a story that had lodged itself in my mind. I didn't think there was any invention involved. I was just going to faithfully record it. And 350 pages later, I had a draft of a novel. So you never know whether it's conceivable I could sit down and start to write something and say, "Oh my gosh, I better keep going with this story because I want to see how it ends up." But Roger, this novel was started in 1997. I mean, eight years after the publication of my first, and I kept approaching it and avoiding it, approaching it and avoiding it. And for me, the only upside of the whole COVID sequestration was that I was already retired, as was my wife. We didn't get out and about very much. Fortunately, my wife and I, after 45 years, get along very, very nicely. I can't imagine marriages that didn't fit that description during that period. But if there was a bright side, it was that I said, well, okay, I'm going to keep writing. I had just published a book of poems in late 2019, exquisite timing. And I said, well, I look at that novel, and this is the time that I'm either going to finish it or burn it up. And I had done 3 or 4 drafts, and it didn't satisfy me, and it would be hard to somehow give you a sketch of the reconsideration that I applied. But at any rate, I did go through it chapter by chapter and as a whole, and I pushed it. I pushed it through to the end. So it only took 17 years to get finished.
When did you know, as you're going through it and going through it, when did you know I've got it this time? I can do this.
I still don't know that. I'm relying on other people who, many of them, people whom I know have read it, and I have to factor in the idea that they are my friends, but they seem to like it very much. But I was very uncertain. I still, to some degree, am, because I'm still, after 2 books, I'm pretty much a beginner as a novelist. But my first book was published by Scribner, not back in 1989, and I went back to, and my agent for that book had long since gone on to his reward. So I approached Scribner because the first book certainly had not been a bestseller, but it had done quite well. And they asked me questions like, "Well, is there any horror in it?" No. Well, yes, but not the kind you're thinking about. If it's speculative, and I think some white ass like, "Well, is it all fiction speculative, or is it young adult?" And Scribner and all the other trade houses, they weren't interested. What I had to do was not what they wanted to sell, and so it was dropped like a hot potato by, I don't know, 8 or 9 New York City publishers and Boston publishers, and I thought, well, Down East Books, it's a Maine centered operation. Maybe they'll be interested. And they snapped it up very quickly. Not only that, they're going to reissue the first novel and a couple of books of essays. I mean, this is all stuff that seems a little bit too easily to have been accomplished, but I'll take it.
It sounds like they were just happy to snap you up and put you in their stable of writers so they could brag about you.
Yeah, well, I hope so. I hope so. But I'm very happy. I didn't realize that Down East Books is part of a big international conglomerate, so they have a lot of resources, and they've done well by me.
Cool. Neat cover, by the way. Actually, almost references something in the book. I won't say what, but yeah.
Yeah. That is a picture of the man I model, the senior of the 2 characters in the novel on, and that picture was taken by a friend of mine who, alas, has since died, who was kind of the generation between me and that old fellow. But it's I said, when when I finished this book, I said, "God, I'll get a hold of that picture," and I knew who would have a copy, so that's how I got it.
Yeah. What do you hope when people close the book the final time they take away with them?
Well, I hope I hope they find the story credible, the characters credible and engaging, the language also engaging, and but on a sort of more spiritual, if you'll pardon me, level. I hope they'll see that all is never lost. That there's you can go deep down into the pit, and there are ways out of it. And I'm not talking about somebody who's living in Gaza or Ukraine. I mean, it's easy to make these kinds of moralizations, but in our relatively comfortable circumstance, you can still find your way to hell, and but there's also a way out. There are various ways out.
Is there anything we haven't touched on you want to make sure that our listeners know about you or the book Now Look, or any other of your accomplishments?
Well, I think your questions have been very penetrating, Roger. Salutes to you. I'm pleased to have had this conversation. Enjoyed it very much. I can't think right offhand what I would add. I think you've covered a lot of territory in a very short compass, and I'm grateful.
All right. Well, you'll think of it as just after we shut off. In fact, the French have a word for it, the wit de l'escalier, the wit of the staircase, the thing you think of as you walk out and go, I should have said that then. So,
well, it's the same thing as when people say, well, who are your favorite contemporary poets? And I'll list 3 or 4, and then I'll get in my car after the interview. Why the hell did I leave her out?
yeah.
So I'm sure you're right that I will think that. But meanwhile, to me, it's been very, very congenial and productive. Thank you.
You bet. Our guest today, Sidney Lee. The book is Now Look. Highest possible recommendation. Go out and buy a bunch for all your friends. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Roger.